11, 11, 11 mean?
Oh.
No, don't shout it out. Raise your hand. Judith. Yes, but, right. This was when it ended, sort of. But it hadn't ended. It's never ended. But anyhow, this is the 11th hour, and that's what this is. 11th day, the 11th month. And that's when the armistice started, which was a really poor idea, but we'll get to that. Okay, I want you to read this and think about it, and I've got to prove this to you in 2 sessions, because I can't do it all in one, so I'm coming back next month, and I hope you'll return. Most wars have causes, don't they? This really doesn't, and that's very weird sounding, I'm sure. But it really didn't, but at the other end of it was nothing but effects, and they're still going on today. Just ask the people in Palestine. And, it all started in 1917. Okay, I'd like to digress before I even start. And this is not about me, but I do want to tell you something about my father and what he did for me. Thank you. I think this is good parenting. At first, he was in World War II, and he was a naval officer, and he went to England. And I don't know, I don't remember him coming back or anything like that, but he did, and he brought with him some beautiful smooth stones from the Cornish coast on the English Channel. And that was a little girl, a little 8-year-old or whatever, however I was when I found out that. It was thrilling to see these smooth stones from the beach, from one of the beaches in England, just lying there, and he brought a bunch of them back, and I still have them. And then later, when I went to the same place in Cornwall that he told me about, this small town, and picked up some stones too, some English stones, and brought them back. So that I have a mixture of his stones and my stones, and they just mean a lot. But that really thrilled me. And then he also, when we would go on car trips to the beach, let's say, when I was growing up, I don't know how it started, but he started me. I got to be his navigator. And oh, by the way, during World War II, he had taught navigation at Harvard University, and he was a chemist and a professor, and he was a naval officer, and he did go to England, but the rest of the time he taught at Harvard. So there we were as little girls, my sister and I, and we'd go to the beach every summer, and the North Carolina beaches. And I got to sit up front in the navigator's seat, and he would provide me with the North Carolina State Highway map. And I'd spread it out, you know how they do. I'd just spread it out on my lap. And so all the way to the beach, 6 hours probably then, he would ask, not every minute, he'd ask, what town is coming up next? And what highways are we on? This was before interstates, I'm sure. We went on 70, we went on 64, we went on 421, and different ones to the beaches. And so I would sit there the whole time. And then we always had to stop in Goldsboro and get barbecue. And then we'd also have to stop in Dover. Anyone know where Dover, North Carolina is? It's on the way to the beach. But my dad, his Uncle Matt, had a big filling station or something, and with one of those big old freezers, from the past, and he'd say to us, go and get yourself a Coke out of there or something. That was thrilling for us little girls, to go and just, that a person, our family had that filling station filled with drinks. So that went on for years, and I don't remember what years. I just was little, but then I kept on going, doing that navigating. And so I learned maps. I learned to love maps and to read them. I like to read maps, not just look at them, but read them. And I wouldn't teach history without a map nearby. They have to go together. So then another thing he did. Oh yes. I have to tell you this. As a boy, he used to tell us. As a boy, he used to play. He carried papers in the streets, sold papers in the streets of Greensboro growing up. But one thing he did, he would tell me and my sister about this game that he would play. It has a bad word in it, but I thought everybody'd sit right up, but they didn't. It's not very bad. But anyhow, he always said that when he was a little boy, it was during World War I. And he said he and his friends used to play a game called Kick the Kaiser in the Can. And so my sister and I said, oh, that's a bad word, you can't say that. But that's the only bad word I've ever heard him say. Let's see what, all right, so, then another thing he did was, he bought us our first television for June 2nd, 1953. What happened that day? Any hands in the air? No? Yes. Way to go, Doris. That was the coronation of the Queen, who was most of my life on earth knowing. The Queen's coronation, it really got to me. One aside that's really not too important, but I'll just tell you. We invited my cousin Ann to come and spend the night and watch the coronation with us. And unfortunately, after the coronation, there was a movie on the new television that we just stayed up to see, and it was called House of Wax with Vincent Price. If you've never seen it, don't bother now. And we spent the whole night looking out the bedroom window to see if that face was going to show. It was just awful. It was awful. But that didn't have anything to do with the coronation. But that made me just love English history and British history. And I was always seeing movies with Gene Simmons and Stuart Granger about the monarchs. And after a while, I got tired of those tutors. They were always beheading people, and they were always bothered, fussing about the church and state and who was going to rule. Was the monarch going to rule or the Pope in Rome? And I went to a more modern time now, and so I really like now the years about 1700 to 1945, and not a day later. But I like all European history too. So I think my dad really started and fed that interest in history and in English history, and so you can get to something like that, just by somebody's influence. Okay, what we'll have to do is we're going to have to race through the 18th and 19th centuries. I'm sorry, but I hope you won't panic. And we're headed for the exits. We have to do the 18th and 19th century, but they won't take long. Don't worry. Okay. There's something called, some historians, I guess we'll do this first. Okay. On your maps, look at the plainer side. This shows the way Europe sort of divided itself up into hostility. Great Britain and France and Russia were the three empires, and there were 6 empires that had gotten themselves together by about 1900, and here they are, and they're up here too. This war was not a United States war at all, but we did join it. But we joined, President Wilson went to Congress, and we entered the war on April 6, 1917. It's about in the middle. But our troops never even got there until the summer or late spring of 1918. And so we were only we only had about 4 months of combat in France and Belgium, because the United States, it wasn't our war at all, but we had allies still. All right, so the Allied powers are Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Ottoman Empire. And then the Allied powers are Great Britain and France and the Russian Empire. And it wasn't, at that time, it wasn't fully communist, but they interrupted the war by bowing out of the war because they were losing, and then the Russian Empire became communist Russia, Soviet Russia. But these are the empires, and let's find out how do you think an empire grows? It's got to have certain things, and one of the reasons I like England so much in the past is that England was the place where World War where industrial revolution started. And it's because England had so much going for it. You can't really have an empire if you can't keep it going and you don't have the resources. England in about the 1700s, early 1700s, had a lot of resources. They had underground, they had copper, and tin and coal, a lot of it. And they had fast rivers and fast streams for hydroelectric power. And then you begin to have a new kind of power in the world, and that's steam power. And think about, before that time, way back in the centuries before, if you wanted to go anywhere, you walked, or you rode on an animal, or you rode in a cart pulled by an animal. And so all of a sudden, there's going to be a more modern time coming up. And I don't know if I can show this anywhere. I can't really show it. I don't really know how to plan this too well. But yeah, okay, do that. There's something called the European moment in history, which starts about 1700 to 1900. Yeah, that's nice. Okay, and it has two major developments that we can call a modern thing. It's a new kind of society, using the word modern. That had never really been used before. And the other is power and influence. These modern societies were able to have power and influence over others. And from that you can get, there are three areas especially: weapons, transport, and speed. You have to make them modern in order to have a big, large war going on. And so that began to happen over this time until 1900. Let's just put that down. And look at this. Oh, I know, let's do this first, sorry. She's very good at helping. This was Europe in, again, 1700 to 1900 are sort of the years to see where all this is coming from, but it's not causing anything. All through, okay, yeah, that is better. Revolutions. Down a little, I said. Down a little more, a little more. There, yeah, it's the,
Now that's.
yeah. Okay, in the, by 1914, these things had happened. In the 17 and 1800s, you had lots of revolutions. Name some of the revolutions. You can shout it out, you don't have to raise your hand. American, industrial, French, agricultural revolution in England especially, populist. You had a lot of changes. And then eventually, after the revolutions, you're going to have some kind of reaction. You can have bad reactions and good reactions. Good reaction might be reform. But then sometimes, what happened in these 2 centuries is, it was not just good reform always, it was hostile sometimes, because you could block some other country from growing or getting things, or you could reform them and make things better. And one thing a modern society always had in it is the need for, or the wish for speed. Speed was very important because everything was slow before. And once you have steam power, you're able to make machinery that moves on its own, that moves and will take you someplace quickly. And other things, you can print newspapers. Newspapers came in about the 1700s. And of course you could print those really fast. It wasn't just movable type, it was a new way to print things and to get the message out. In revolution, and then reforms always try to make it better. But then there are going to be other things. The word nationalism is just, this is not political, it's nothing but pure history. And history is facts and nothing else. And so we're not talking politics or anything else. The word nationalism can be a real burner. But you might want to know how it started. And when it started, it had different meanings. And all through these centuries, many different meanings to conservatism, nationalism, liberalism, communism, socialism. All of those things were going on at these times. But they don't necessarily mean what they know today. And it's hard to know about that unless you've studied a little bit, because interesting how, I don't have time to go into that, but you can find that out on your own, I'm sure. But I'd like to see some of the different meanings of it now. Okay, then the alliances were taking place in these empires all during these 2 centuries. Alliances could be a really negative thing, because you've got these three lined up on one side, those three lined up on the other side, and in the middle, that's supposed to be sort of an explosion, which is going to happen in 1914. But really, the whole 19th century almost was without war. Little wars, but not any big conflagrations. And the main thing they had to do was get rid of the Napoleonic era. And so in 1815, there goes Napoleon. He's no longer a problem, but he was a big problem in a lot of those decades in there. Well, after Napoleon, okay, can you put that down in, okay, let's do this. All right, here I've got, this is good, yeah, revolution and reaction. Okay, revolution is, let's talk about what's the difference in revolution and rebellion, those two words.
Revolution works.
Revolution is permanent, isn't it? It's supposed to be permanent. A rebellion can be a lot of different things, just, refusal to do something, or storming the Bastille or something. You can do those things to rebel against authoritarian governments too. That would be. But revolution means it's a change that's never going to go away now, and we have those changes from the revolution. Okay, after Napoleon, right in the middle there in the yellow, this is after Napoleon in 1815 is gone finally, and he had really upset Europe, and you would know that. But the plan for Europe was, in those words over there, the Congress of Vienna was supposed to knit back Europe into maybe a happier place, a more workable place where there was less hostility and less violence. So the Congress of Vienna, I sometimes blame that for World War I, because what they did is, they didn't mean to do it, they put into Europe a whole bunch of ethnicities that didn't always work together. And it was a law, and it was to keep somebody like Napoleon coming again and disrupting things. So this was a major milestone, because what you've got to have is a balance of power. To have peace, you've got to have a balance of power, and that's a diplomatic, that's just one of the bases of diplomacy anywhere. You've got to be balanced. Well, Europe wasn't very balanced. I mean, it wasn't balanced with Napoleon. Once he was gone, they hoped to find a balance of power. Okay, Judith, let's get that one that says the one farthest over. Get that. So this European moment was going through these 2 centuries, and it was making things, it was supposed to make things more stable. After revolution, you want stability. But stability can come in a good way, and it can come in an authoritarian way too. So you have to watch out what you ask for, or what you try to get. The power of the people had not started really until the Enlightenment in the 1700s, let's say. All of a sudden, people began to speak up more, but there was enough of, the revolutions were some of that speaking up. Okay, let's, this one, all right, Judith. Here were some of the modern, here's just to, yeah. Yeah, okay. Modernity means some of those things. I mean, there had been a Europe all through those centuries, and they had old ways. They're called old ways. It was old religion, old church. There was only one church for many centuries. The Catholic Church was also the only Christian embodiment. And then along came the Protestant Reformation, and those changes were huge all over Europe. I'm just concentrating on Europe, not anyone else, but things were happening other places too. But when you get this kind of thing going on, you're going to want to have a more stable environment to grow up in and to do things in. And England began to have all these advantages. They had they started the Industrial Revolution, literally. They had an empire. Other European countries had an empire. And you have to have an empire, you've got to have a lot going for it. You've got to have a lot of resources. Now, here's an example in the 20th century, the Japanese, they're another island nation. Great Britain is an island nation, and it became a big empire, the biggest. In the 1930s, the Japanese knew they were an island nation, and they wanted to have an empire too, because others had empires. Well, they found out they didn't have any real resources on their islands, not the kind that you would need for modern confrontations and modern government. And so they got there, in order to have a modern nation, you would have to have tin and rubber and oil and things that would make airplanes and things that would make shipping, large ships and airplanes and so on. And they didn't have those things. Well, they tried to get them, and they could have bought them from other countries, but they took them from some countries and they bought some from other countries. But England didn't have that problem. They had natural resources right under the ground and all around, and then they were able to have a worldwide empire. Not the first, though, in Europe. Spain, Portugal were the first to have empires that reached into the New World, into the Americas. But then pretty soon England started trying to do that too. And that's sort of where the lost colony comes in for me. That's one of my interests, and I don't think it'll ever be solved, because we're trying to dig up most of Bertie County and some of what's down east, but they've done a lot of that, and they're not finding everything they want to. At this point, is there anyone who'd like to ask a question? No, you might not get a great answer, I don't know. But if you have a question, okay, just you can raise your hand anytime you have one.
I have a question.
Okay.
You said at the beginning of one of your cards that there's no cause.
Right. Yeah.
And what does somebody say the cause was? I mean, surely somebody somewhere said yes.
Historians have been working, and I'm no historian. I don't have a PhD, but historians have many views on it. Some of the best books. One of my favorite books is called "Sleepwalking to War." That sort of says something. In other words, they let it happen, because nobody had anything that would cause clashing of arms. They had rivalries, and they had other things going on like that, but they didn't seem to be enough to start a war. And maybe the idea of Napoleon and what he had done to Europe scared people. We're not going to fight unless something big happens. And nothing big happened. And they were able to contain some wars, like the Crimean War, which is 2 or 3 years, I guess. It was a war that did draw in European nations, but it just didn't go anywhere big. So somebody was able to keep all this going. And you had to have stability, you had to have a balance of power. And this Congress of Vienna, which was in 1815, was going to solve everything, did do pretty well. And they kept a lot of stability. But stability can have two sides too. You can have a gentle or a positive stability, or you can have dictatorship or stabilities. It makes it stable, but it makes it stable at the expense of some things. Okay, so this is all a lot of fun to read up on, and I know you can fill in the rest of this, I'm sure, with looking up things. And you probably know most of this. I don't. Please forgive me if I tell you things you know, but it's just this is okay. Oh, did it slide on its own? I can't get it. Oh, okay. Oh, can you all hear me? Okay. Yeah, just raise your hand if you can. You can't hear me? Okay. Should I do this? That's better. Okay. Oh, it does. Okay. Somehow I get around in here. About this sign, which Judith brought up, it does seem strange that nothing would cause a big misery like First World War, but all these balance of power, people were keeping the balance, and I've got to get to this part too. Let's look at the map. You have your map.
I have a question.
Okay.
Before you do it.
Okay.
Where's Crimea?
Oh, it's around in the Black Sea in the Ottoman Empire.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But you see, the Ottoman Empire is one of the sides, the Axis sides. So they had a huge empire, the Ottoman Empire. Do you know really what was in the Ottoman Empire? What we call the Holy Land for Islam, for Christianity, for Judaism. All these lands, Greece and Romania and some of those areas, and Persia, Egypt, on down into parts of North Africa. So that was a huge empire, and they had a lot. Were into Africa and Asia, collecting colonies. And then the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire were very important. There they are in the central part of Europe. Germany has always had a big problem. They're in the center of Europe, and you don't want a two-front war, because look at who they're surrounded by. France and England, and then Russia on the other side. And England didn't have a big army, but Russia had a huge army, just almost endless, unlimited. And then Austro-Hungarian Empire, some people have said that started the war. The assassination in Sarajevo of the Archduke and Archduchess, and that did not cause the war at all, but the war started about a year after that. And so it was a dynastic thing only, and the emperor of Austria-Hungary was Franz Joseph at that time, and he was the uncle of the Archduke who was murdered, and he didn't like him. He didn't like his nephew at all. His nephew had married a commoner instead of somebody royal, and anyhow, when he was killed, the emperor wasn't bothered by it at all. And that didn't start a war, even though it was done by some terrorists. Yes.
What's this country in the right corner called? N-E-J-O. N-E-J-E.
That's a good question. I don't know what that would be. Is that a D or an O? It's a D. N-E, I don't know.
It's Montenegro, right?
Oh, I guess, yeah, no, Montenegro is up in the other part. Montenegro is near Albania.
Oh, you're talking about down,
He's talking about way down.
yeah, way down, okay.
I don't know, but there's Egypt and then the countries of Lebanon and Syria and so on go along there on the Mediterranean from there. I don't know that it's even a country, although Persia is, so I guess maybe is Iraq there?
No.
You can look that up in those smartphones.
Talking about Montenegro?
No, because it's way up here, it's near Greece. It's the one way down in the corner. It's just a combination of letters, but I don't know what it stands for. That's interesting, isn't it? But it's interesting that the way the great powers got lined up was just a slash right down here, a slanted line. But the problem is that Germany is in a bad position, and Austria-Hungary too, but Germany always try to avoid a two-front war, because you can't very well prosecute a two-front war. You're going to divide your armies until they're weak. Oh, it's the Emirates. No, they're along the Gulf. Yeah, they're along the Persian Gulf, aren't they?
Now they're.
It says Emirate of N-E-D-J. Oh, that's an Arabic name then. That is a word. The Emirate of N-E-Y-D, Naid or something, or a second Saudi state. A second Saudi state. Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, I wouldn't have known that at all. But see, that empire, Ottoman Empire, was so, I mean, it was just spreading out pretty fast. And they had lots of armed people for fighting. Austria-Hungary had big armies. Germany had big armies. So I mean, they were all armed. They were these 6 empires were pretty well armed by then with these weapons of modern warfare. and let's think of some of the modern weapons. You used to have horseback, swords, cannons, muskets. All right, they're not modern at all. They're old and slow.
Ships,
Some, what?
the naval power.
Yes, ships. Britain had the best navy and the biggest navy then, but some other countries did too. Germany didn't have much of a navy, but they were desperately building one because they wanted to be on a par with England. Another modern innovation, I guess, was the rifling of repeating rifles. They had muskets before, one shot, then you have to load it. And it takes a long time to load a musket. And I guess it's, repeating rifles, they had some in the American Civil War, but they weren't really perfected. And they had in the American Civil War just a little entrenchment around Richmond. I didn't know much about that, but Richmond and Petersburg, I think, probably had some entrenchment. But it really broke out into World War I.
Yeah, I took a trip, Civil War trip, and the first foxholes were in Petersburg.
Oh, okay. And that was in the 1760s, I mean the 1860s. So that was before, but nothing else was like the Great War when it came. And I don't want to call it World War I because it wasn't World War I. It was the Great War. I always like to be where it's happening, not looking back on it. So I couldn't look back on it. I mean, I couldn't call it World War I at the time, could I? It wasn't. It was the Great War, a total war. And it was called the Total War, and still people don't agree on why it happened. That's a big why and a big how. Those are the two questions I like to answer in history. Not the what, where, when. That's easy enough to find, but the how and the why these things happen and how they happened. And that makes a good study, I think, for it, to find out. Yes?
I may be jumping outside with this, but you're all familiar with the Third Reich.
Pardon?
You're all familiar with the Third
Yes,
Reich.
yes.
Well, are you tying also the Second Reich and the First Reich to that?
Mm-mm.
Okay,
We're not doing anything like that today. In a month we will, when I come back.
that's fine.
Yeah, well, that was a good question.
Oh, keep that for everybody else, we couldn't hear him.
Oh, that's right.
Nobody behind him can hear.
Will you stand up and just say it, please, but loud, because I can't.
Everybody is familiar with the Third Reich. I want to know if you can tie together the Second Reich and the First Reich, which are, practically the Third Reich, so she can get that later.
Yes, but I'm going to stop about 1918 with what happens and the awfulness that's going to happen, because that's when the fighting stopped. But then we're going to go and spend some time with the terrible Treaty of Versailles, which can't talk about it now. But of course, World War II was caused by a certain definite cause, whereas World War I wasn't. Just some things happened to come together, and I'm going to finish it next time. I don't want to. There's a lot to it, and you can study it all too. Study up for it with your funds, which I don't have. But it's a very conflicted thing. And another wonderful book that from a historian that I like is called "The War That Ended the Peace." And it was the war that ended the peace. That's true, because from then on there hasn't been any peace. 20 years after this, World War II starts. And that was a direct cause, but some people have thought that they're the same war, just continued, and they're not at all. They don't have the same start, they don't have the same endings, they don't have the same anything going on. Yes?
Do you have any thoughts on, you said all those countries had fairly big armies?
Yes.
The century before hadn't had much war. Why did they have big armies?
Okay, you want to start in the 1700s? Those 2 centuries? I mean, no, I don't want to do it the whole
I
thing.
mean, just curious.
But yeah, because everything began to come together I think in the 1700s. More people were born. Populations grew. For instance, in England, they enclosed all these wonderful farmlands in order to make room. A lot of people lost their holdings because the government enclosed all their lands so that they could grow huge crops that would fill lots of coffers and feed a lot of people. So there was more population, and then you had these revolutions. The Industrial Revolution just really, I mean, that's the big major change. Everything's going to be more and better and faster. And I guess we're all still doing that, aren't we, in our societies? We want everything improved. We want things better. I can think of many things that used to cost more than they do now, that are big, and people can have more. But I suppose that's part of the need to improve and to make things faster, to make things easy to use. So that, and when you do that, you can cut down an enemy easier too. You can take care of other people. But World War I did not, it was not a continuous war. They were very different, and you'll find that out eventually. But how many, I wanted to ask this at the beginning. Would anybody share with the rest of us what your knowledge of World War I is, or the Great War? Think back to school and high school and your history books or anything. Would anyone be willing to share that? How much you knew about it all the time?
I know very little about
Yeah.
World War I, but
Was it in your high school books?
My thoughts were it was us against Germany.
Yeah, right.
But evidently that wasn't all.
Yeah, right. And we had such a small part of it.
Who was aligned against who
Well, in the,
in World War I?
What was the question?
where I had the, oh, here it is, the empires. No, that's not it. Where's the,
What you looking for?
the six, no,
Oh, okay.
the six, super, there it is, it's on the bottom. No, that, yeah. These empires were all, they were aligned against each other. And a few other countries joined in at times, like Italy did eventually, but not in the beginning. It was these six empires that were all pretty powerful, and powerful in some different ways. Not everybody had a huge navy, or anybody had a huge standing army or anything like that, but they had enough of, they had enough that it made them powerful, and it could influence the people in each of these places. And pretty soon, well, I'm gonna do that next time, about how it ended in gunfire in 1914, but it's not the same people, or not the same things going on in 1940, in 1939. But that was 20 years difference in there, and those were a rough 2 decades. And those things did stem from World War, from the Great War, and especially from the armistice and the treaty. And I think that they caused the terrible parts of the future, but we'll get into that later.
And I remember gas, the use of gas.
Yes,
in
poison
World
gas.
War I.
Yeah, poison gas, right? And that hadn't been done before either. I mean, way back in the other centuries.
Who started that?
I think Germany did, but I think, it got around to everybody. And I'd have to look up and see who started it. Yes.
I never learned anything about World War I in high school.
Yeah, I didn't either.
Because it was all about World War II, because
Right.
our fathers had all been. in World
Exactly,
War
yeah.
I learned about World War I through studying English literature, especially early 20th century
Yes.
English literature. And the artists, the writers of that period were devastated by that war. Especially the women who lost their husbands, their fiancés, their boyfriends, whatever. My impression of how that war started was that it was, do use a rather crude term, a pissing match. That you had these big empires, and they were all afraid that somebody else was gonna become more powerful than them. And they were kind of all jockeying back and forth.
Exactly.
And there was also a family connection, because the Tsar of Russia and Queen Victoria and the Kaiser, they were all,
And the King of England?
the King of England, yes, they were all related.
Yes.
And I think that was kind of like a sibling rivalry too.
Dynastic rivalry, exactly.
And the other thing is, I don't think those people realize how destructive their new weapons could be.
Exactly.
What effect gassing people would have. How, machine guns could just wipe out whole, what do you call it, battalions or whatever the unit was. You can't go just charging across like you used to with your bayonet and all of that.
Yeah.
Because there's some guy on the other side with a machine gun who's gonna just go, everyone's dead. And then it got into this thing where they're all in trenches. Nobody can advance very much.
Excellent. You sure have read the right things. But, I don't want to interrupt you, but you said that better than I could. But about trenches, about trench warfare, that's another major change that happened that had never happened before. Before, armies met on battlefields. I mean, we have one right over there in New Garden areas with the American Revolution. Armies for centuries had met on battlefields facing each other, some cannon, maybe some muskets, maybe bows and arrows, back in the 14th century. I mean, they all faced each other. That's called offensive fighting, offensive war. So the problem with the Great War is that the commanders were old guys, not that there's anything wrong with old guys, but they were old guys who had old notions and old tactics in their mind. That's how you fought a war, and there was no other way, because it was before the age of industry and what industry does to everything. So they were fighting on battlefields. In the Great War, they fought what they thought was that kind of war, that old war, as much as they could, and they spent the next 3 years entrenched on the Western Front, and they couldn't go anywhere. And then they were fighting a defensive war, and it was new to them. They knew nothing except an offensive kind of war, where you charge the enemy, you charge your enemy, you attack them. But in a defensive war, they were on defense for 3 whole years, the rest of the war. And on the Western Front, the Eastern Front over in Russia and those areas, that was a different thing. You did do some lining up, but it's still, and you didn't entrench in the Eastern Front either. There are some maps that have a line, and I was looking for this. The line of trenches in the Western Front goes from the English Channel down to the Swiss Alps. But I don't have it on here. You could find it, but I want to draw it in. I like to do things by hand and looking at them and on paper. But the trenches wound like this, all the way into the Swiss Alps. And they were never straight. Why weren't they straight? Who could answer? Why didn't you build a trench that was just a straight line?
Explosions.
Had to go around the hard rock.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because let's say somebody broke into your trench, and if they just, if they used some artillery straight, they could take all of you out. So they were zigzag patterns, so that their fire, the enemy's fire, would stop at the end of a wall, instead of just going straight through. They had all that worked out, and they stayed in trenches all this time, and even today, in Belgium and France, you can go and visit not only trenches, but caves, in which they had rooms, and even in some of the trenches in some of the areas, they had bedrooms, if you want to call it that. They had desks set up. They had furniture in those trenches. In some places they were small, of course, and they had what was called a step. and a firing step. And you would, on the side of the trench, they were pretty much like this. They weren't like this, because you had to live in them and walk in them. But you could stand up on a little step of land and fire over the top. And then you got back in, and it would be above your head. I mean, it had to be high in order, because you gotta live there, you gotta sleep there. Commanders stayed down in there sometimes. It was just like a city down in there. But it stretched about 450 miles or something. That line of trenches, about 425 or 450 something. I mean, 550 something. That's a long line of trenches.
Which side dug the trenches? Pardon my ignorance.
No, it's not ignorance at all. Everybody did. They just learned to entrench.
Just both sides?
Yeah.
Dug some trenches?
Yeah.
Everybody
And-
with a shovel.
And then they also had barbed wire, which, made it, you couldn't charge up like in the old way of doing war. You couldn't charge up over the top. You could try, but you didn't get very far. They would mow you down on the other, artillery would be over here. It would just mow you down when you came up out of your trench with your guns. And, of course, the barbed wire was to keep the enemy out of your trench. And that was a new, I don't know when that started, that's a new thing too at that time. And then the different kinds of guns, heavy artillery that shoots shells from, I don't know how many miles, but they could shoot some of them a mile and maybe more than that. I don't know those numbers. But this was something you'd never had before. This was old-fashioned tactics with new modern weapons, and they didn't go together. And the commanders didn't know how to handle it. They didn't know what to do with them, because you should be in your zone, where like if you're gonna fight an offensive war, you know just how to make it happen. And these old guys, as I said, had their ways of doing things, but it didn't work on that kind of landscape. And you didn't have traditional armies facing each other. There was no place to face anybody. There was mud everywhere, and there were hills in northern France and places. There were hills, hilliness, mud, all kinds of everything. You couldn't just have big armies facing each other. Yeah.
Were there tanks in the?
Oh, and tanks. Tanks were started, and yes, and U-boats. And in the American Civil War, I don't know much about American history, but didn't they have some submarines in the Civil War?
Oh, yes,
Or
yeah.
they were funny looking, but
The Monitor.
the Monitor and the Merrimack,
Yeah.
we learned about those.
Yeah.
But they were nothing, this was a new kind of look in the Great War, and they were used a lot to block any help coming over to any country. You could block out the enemy this way. And the United States, I think this is interesting too, and I didn't know it all those years, but the United States, it wasn't our war at all, and but the president wanted, or some, I don't know who, wanted us to join the war. I'd have to look at that. But we did have allies. France and England were our allies, and they were being attacked and so on. So we finally joined, but we didn't do anything but for about 4 months, from maybe June or July, August, or it was about 4 months of actual fighting, in the wooded areas and in the mud and everything. So those times, the United States did something. And then they wanted us, the Germans wanted us to make an armistice so that they could sort of, here's another big problem. France particularly wanted to punish the Germans for starting the war. They said they started it. And then the Americans and the British leaders did not want to punish them so much, but I really want to talk next time about that, about the unbelievable kinds of punishments to put on the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians for losing the war. But the Germans didn't think they lost the war. That's another problem, which is going to come up, because their country was not fought in. They didn't lose any territory, I don't think, or a little, but not much. Their armies did not come into their country. And yes.
Going back to the commentary you asked, what you studied history or
Mhm.
studied history about it. One thing that hit me stuff that the French had the better commanders. It's really surprising.
And the French mutinied later in the war.
Yeah.
They left first. A lot of things, yeah, if you just read it, you'll find out just so much that's going on. But it's a very unusual war because it's the first modern war, what would be called the first modern war. And it just, part of the whole effort was to use old tactics, and part was to use new weapons. They don't go together at all, but we'll find out next time how. Oh, I should stop. One thing, you're not going to have to sit here long and starve. I know that lunch is coming up. Yes.
You mentioned 2 books.
Mhm.
Can you tell us the authors?
Yes.
I would like to read those books.
I will, but they're upstairs. I'm so sorry. But Margaret Mitchell, a Canadian author, is excellent. Forgot the name. Anyhow, I have a list
Tell
upstairs.
us the names of the book again, anyway.
Would you like me to print a little list?
Yeah.
There's some
yeah.
wonderful books out there that just, not just all new, but over the years, and some are pretty new. And of course, they have the different perspectives. They have to rely on facts, not supposition. It irritates me when people think that history can just be anything. It's not supposition or guesses. It's just the facts. And that's nice. It doesn't have to go into anything else. Let's see. Sleepwalking to War is one of my favorites, and see, that author makes a case for that. And then the other one I told you about, and then The War That Ended the Peace. The War That Ended the Peace. Yeah. So we can get the author's name, but I'll bring a list, and thank you so much for wanting me to do that. And I realize that, you know, I'm just loving history, and I think that people in this room do too. I mean, how nice of you all to come, because it shows what I've always wanted, for people to be interested in history. And it's not in the past to me at all. Even reading about it and talking about it, I'm trying to think what it looked like in the 18th century, what it looked like in the 19th century. Because you gotta have a feel for it, I think. Otherwise, some of these things wouldn't make sense at all. Yeah. And somebody here, yeah.
I'm gonna bug you to death, Karen, I apologize.
No, you're not. We're going to lunch.
Three movies I think y'all people understand,
Mhm.
1917,
Yes,
All Quiet on the Western Front,
excellent.
and what was that third one? War Horse.
Oh, right. Those are 3 excellent movies that really make you see it. Because, well, you get to see it because it's a movie. But it just makes a lot of, it makes it come real, but it wasn't in my history books in high school, and maybe the same with you. And you were saying this too, and several of you, that they must have skipped over it for World War II, because that was bigger in a lot of ways. But there had been no catastrophe like the Great War until then. 1917, and War Horse, and
All
All Quiet on the Western Front. There's a new make of that, and there was an old one too, I think. I don't know,
Yeah.
1940s or something. No, I don't know.
And that was the book.
It was a book.
And
yeah.
a book by Eric Maria Remarque. So that, there's some wonderful books, but I keep these books near me, sort of, around where I can see them, because I like to refer to them. I think you'd enjoy, they're readable. They don't get too bogged down in facts, and you can't just have so many of them that it overwhelms you. But it's just, to me, history is just pleasure. It's not hard or anything, it's a pleasure. Now, I'm not that way with math. I don't love math. I detested math. And, but, we have our areas that we like. But I think maybe you like history or you wouldn't be here. Yes?
My father was in World War I, and about all I learned from him was that the only basic training they had was from Hoboken to Liverpool on the ship, 3 weeks. And the other things he said out in York was over when he goes to the
Thank you for that. I am glad to hear that. And that's such an important point that I didn't say yet, but I'm going to talk about it next time, I suppose. We've got to leave, haven't we? But what happened was that when we came to France, our armies finally came to France in 1918 in the spring. And we only had a few months to fight over there. We had no training at all. We had a very small army here in the United States, and they practiced with wooden guns, toys, literally, they did. They had very few real arms, because they were we just didn't have big armies. We had a small army here. And they had to grow an army really fast to send over to France. And we did, but it took a lot of training, and they even had to train once they got there. They couldn't do it all here in the US. They had to do some of it in France and Belgium. Oh, and let me tell you why England got into it. England didn't have a dog in the fight at all, except the Germans made it happen that England would have to enter. Because England in the early 1800s became the guarantor of Belgium's peace through some dynastic things going on. And so once the German armies crossed from Germany into Belgium and into France, then that brought England in. And the last thing I want to say about this is one of my favorite quotes ever, and I just love this man. I didn't know him, of course, and I don't think he was any George Clooney, but he's one of my favorite people. Sir Edward Grey was the British foreign minister, and he said on the night of August 1st or 4th or something, when Britain entered the war, he said, he just was looking out the window, that, and he just happened to say this, and people knew about it and told about it. He said, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We will not see them lit again in our lifetime." I love that quote. It is so prescient, and imagine him knowing that. The lamps haven't always come on anyhow in some parts of the world. Thank you for coming, and just enjoy lunch, please.
I have one more question.
And Henry's hand has been up.
Just one other point of interest. My father was in General Patton's tank corps when they got to
And here's his father's over here.
Germany, or France.
Yeah.
And I asked him, what kind of things do you have to treat? What kind of wounds? He said, mostly neck injuries, because they had these tanks with a short wheelbase, and they'd get to a trench, and it'd go like this, and they'd have neck injuries.
That's very important. We'll talk about that next time. Here are his father. Wonderful pictures, very clear, very nice. Okay, have fun at lunch.